We're interested in knowing which locations and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. So, before we start, I ask you to leave, in the comments where you're watching from, and the precise time you're listening to this narration. Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases documented in Missouri history. Roads were primitive then, little more than dirt paths carved into the wilderness, connecting scattered settlements. For travelers, the journey through these hills could take days, and safe shelter was a blessing sought after sunset. In 1867, the American Civil War had ended just 2 years earlier, leaving the nation wounded and struggling to heal. Most people were just trying to rebuild their lives in the rugged, isolated hills of the Missouri Ozarks. There was a small cabin along one such road, about 17 miles northeast of Springfield in Webster County, which many travelers recalled passing. It was not shown on any maps, but the locals knew it as the Stillwell place, named for the two brothers who had made their home there sometime around 1863, and it was set back from the road about 50 yards, partially hidden by a stand of oak trees, with a small hand-painted sign that said simply, "Water and rest for weary travelers." Neighbors characterized the Stillwell brothers as quiet men who didn't cause any trouble. The brothers had arrived during the chaos of the war, and like many who appeared in those chaotic times, few questioned their origins or past. The brothers, Elias the elder at 37, and Jeremiah 34, were known to offer water from their well and occasionally a meal or place to sleep for those passing through. They kept to themselves most of the time, though they occasionally ventured into the nearby town of Marshfield for supplies. On December 12, 1867, a postal carrier named Thomas Weston was traveling through Webster County when a heavy snowfall started, and he sought refuge at the Stillwell cabin, as he had done twice previously, according to the statement he later gave to county officials. What he found there would lead to one of the most unsettling investigations in Ozark history, one that, despite initial scrutiny, would remain an unsolved cold case for almost a century. This is a documented account compiled from county records, Springfield, Missouri, weekly Patriot newspaper articles, first-hand accounts, and evidence gathered by the Webster County Sheriff's Department in 1867 and 1868, with some records later retrieved during a 1952 courthouse renovation, adding details previously believed to be lost. No one realized that the Stillwell brothers had been providing visitors with something far more deadly than water as the winter of 1867 descended on the Ozarks. Their hospitality had secrets that would plague Webster County for generations to come. Thomas Weston, a 31-year-old scout in the war, was familiar with the trials of the trail, having traveled through some of the most isolated areas of the county on his postal route. There was a lot of snow falling that December afternoon, and visibility was poor. He later testified that he nearly missed the turn to Stillwell Place, only realizing it when his horse abruptly stopped close to the path. The Stillwells seldom left their property in the winter, and Weston reported that the cabin looked different somehow, with no smoke from the chimney despite the cold, and no lantern in the window like there usually was. He approached cautiously, observing that there were no fresh tracks in the snow, which struck him as strange. It was the kind of quiet that makes a man's ears ring, Weston wrote, adding that the interior was dark and unusually cold, with a half-eaten meal on the table, the food hardened with frost, and only cold ashes in the fireplace. Weston claimed he called out multiple times before attempting the door, which he found unlocked. Weston, worried and perplexed, made the decision to continue to Marshfield, despite the worsening weather, to report his discovery to Sheriff James Harrington after searching the cabin and finding no sign of the brothers. Their coats still hung by the door, their rifles still mounted above the fireplace, as if they had simply disappeared in the middle of a meal. The first theories were straightforward. Maybe the brothers had gone hunting and got caught in the storm, or maybe they had relatives nearby that they had visited. However, the sheriff was sufficiently disturbed by the abandoned meal to send out a search party the next day, and what they discovered, or rather, what they didn't find, marked the start of a mystery that would only grow more complex over time. In the summer of 1863, when the war had reduced the Ozarks to a lawless frontier and Missouri, a border state with conflicting loyalties, was the scene of some of the bloodiest guerrilla warfare of the war, the Stillwell brothers had made an appearance in Webster County. In the midst of this chaos, it was hardly surprising that two brothers had bought a piece of land and constructed a cabin. Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell, who claimed to be from Kentucky but provided little other information about their background, purchased their property from a widow named Margaret Holloway, whose husband had been killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek, using gold coins, which was unusual enough to be mentioned in the deed, according to land records recovered in 1952. The Stillwell men keep to themselves, but are always proper in their dealings, wrote Martha Simmons, who owned the general store in Marshfield at the time, in a journal discovered among her personal belongings after her death in 1881. The younger one, Jeremiah, has a nervous manner about him, always watching the door. Most of the time, the elder talks for both of them. They buy a lot of salt, coffee, and other preservation supplies. Elias said that they smoke meat to survive the winter, but I've never seen them purchase a lot of livestock. Within a year, the brothers had built a small lean-to shelter where travelers could rest if necessary, and by 1865, they occasionally provided meals for a small fee or trade goods. The brothers quickly gained a reputation for providing travelers with clean water, and their well, which was dug deeper than most in the area, provided cool, clear water even during dry spells. The brothers' operation is explained by a comment made in January 1868 by Jacob Miller, a cattle driver who frequently traveled the road. They'd have stew ready most days. He said that they hunted their own meat, and that, although having a tiny garden patch, they never did much farming. Good, hearty stuff, he continued. While the younger one fetched water or took care of the horses, the older one, Elias, would engage in discussion. Even though they claimed to have a lot of tourists, I can't remember ever seeing any other passengers there while I stopped. Nothing about the Stillwells' observed behavior indicated that anything was wrong, but a careful examination of their property after the brothers' disappearance would uncover disturbing contradictions in the tranquil image they had fostered. The Stillwells appeared to be the epitome of the frontier hospitality required for survival in such remote areas. Their establishment was modest, but offered a welcome respite for those traveling the challenging road between Springfield and Point's northeast. When the search party led by Sheriff Harrington arrived at the Stillwell property on December 13, 1867, the snow had stopped and the ground was covered with 8 inches of pure white. 6 men, including the sheriff and Thomas Weston, thoroughly inspected the cabin and its surroundings. The official report, which was recovered during the 1952 renovation, described the search party's findings. No signs of struggle within the dwelling. The personal belongings of brothers seemed to be untouched. An unusual ledger book was found under a floorboard beneath Elias Stillwell's bed. Although the purpose is unknown, the book includes names, dates, and notations of value received. It looks like some pages have been deleted. Though its entire significance was not immediately clear, this ledger, which included 37 entries from October 1863 to November 1867, each with a name, date, and mysterious notations regarding valuable objects, some of which were marked with a simple X, would turn out to be a key piece of evidence. The search also included the property's outbuildings, including a small barn, a smokehouse, and a storage cellar excavated into the hillside behind the cabin. The smokehouse held multiple cuts of meat that the searchers initially thought were pork or venison, and the barn had a single mule and evidence of at least 2 horses, which are now missing. The first really unsettling finding was made in the similar to typical home stores. Preserved goods are kept on wooden shelves. However, the tiny tunnel revealed by the rear wall looks to have been freshly excavated. The tunnel continues for another 27 feet, ending in a chamber that is about 8 feet by 10 feet in size. There are many personal belongings in the chamber, including papers, jewelry, watches, and clothing that seem to belong to different people. The most concerning finding was 32 pairs of boots and shoes in different sizes, some of which looked almost brand new and others with significant wear. Although there were no bodies, no blood evidence, and nothing to definitively prove violence had occurred, the collection of personal belongings was large enough to imply that it had been accumulated over a number of years, and none of the items matched descriptions of the Stillwell brothers' known possessions. The implication was clear. These belongings had probably been taken from others, presumably travelers who had stopped at the cabin. Sheriff Harrington ordered the property sealed and posted guards to prevent tampering with potential evidence while he returned to Marshfield to organize a more thorough investigation. The most incriminating evidence was circumstantial. Why would the brothers have a hidden chamber filled with strangers' belongings? The search party increased their efforts, checking the well and combing the surrounding woods, but the heavy snow hindered their progress. The Stillwell brothers' mysterious disappearance and the discovery of the hidden chamber caused a sensation that quickly spread throughout the county, and on December 17, 1867, the Springfield, Missouri Weekly Patriot featured a front-page story with the headline, "Strange Disappearance in Webster County. Foul Play Suspected." The Stillwell cabin stood silent and empty through the winter of 1867 to 1868, and Sheriff Harrington had it locked and patrolled frequently, but few locals ventured near the property after rumors started to circulate. As winter's hold tightened on the Ozarks, residents started to remember details about the Stillwell brothers that had previously seemed inconsequential, but now took on sinister overtones. Harrington interviewed anyone who had dealt with the brothers, and despite the difficulties of the season, the first significant clues came from a more thorough examination of the ledger book that was discovered beneath the floorboards. Each entry had the same pattern: a name, a date, a notation about valuable items, such as watches, coins, a fine coat, etc., and sometimes information about a destination. Entries that were marked with an X also included a notation about the quality of goods. The last entry, dated November 29, 1867, read, J. Hammond, Springfield Merchant, gold timepiece, $37 in notes, quality goods X. The implications of these matches were troubling but circumstantial. Without bodies or witnesses, it was difficult to prove that the Stillwell brothers had been involved in disappearances. Sheriff Harrington compared these names with reports of missing persons and discovered several matches. Joseph Hammond, a Springfield merchant, had in fact been reported missing by his family after failing to return from a business trip to St. Louis in late November, and William Cooper, mentioned in an entry from July 1867, had vanished while traveling to visit relatives in Springfield. Sheriff Harrington painstakingly compiled a list of all travelers reported missing along the routes near the Stillwell property during January and February of 1868, and the list eventually included 23 names from late 1863, shortly after the brothers had settled in the area. One name on the list was especially noteworthy: Reverend Donovan, a circuit preacher who traveled throughout the Ozarks and had vanished in April 1866 while traveling from Springfield to Lebanon, and his name was noted in the ledger with the notation, "Man of cloth, silver cross, few coins, books of no value. X." The congregation of Reverend Donovan in Lebanon had searched far and wide when he did not show up, but the ledger's mention of his name led to a new search, this time concentrating on the Stillwell property, and on February 23, 1868, during a brief thaw, Sheriff Harrington's deputies discovered a shallow grave about half a mile from the cabin, hidden in a bramble grove in which lay the remains of a man in the ragged remains of clerical clothes. The silver cross, which had been mentioned in the ledger entry, was conspicuously missing. Dr. Hayes's examination notes state that the body showed evidence of extensive post-mortem processing. The remains of Reverend Donovan were the first tangible proof that the Stillwell brothers had been involved in at least one disappearance, but their condition raised serious concerns. Most bones had their flesh carefully removed, indicating an understanding of anatomy. This grim discovery suggested something far more disturbing than simple robbery and murder, hinting at practices so depraved that even hardened frontier lawmen were reluctant to consider the implications. Long bones broken at ends in a manner consistent with marrow extraction. When the ground thawed enough in March 1868 to allow for more thorough excavation, Sheriff Harrington organized a comprehensive search of the property, and according to county records, 20 men participated, methodically excavating the area surrounding the cabin, barn, and cellar. The official report described what they found in clinical terms, but newspaper accounts were more direct. Grim discovery at Stillwell Farm. Human remains unearthed was written in the Springfield, Missouri. Weekly Patriots, March 19, 1868 edition. In 1868, forensic science was still in its infancy, but the county physician who examined the remains, Dr. William Hayes, estimated they belonged to at least 7 different people, and his notes, which are preserved in the county archives, show that some bones showed evidence of being processed with tools similar to those used in butchering animals. The official record states that investigators discovered human remains in 3 locations on the property: in a deep pit behind the barn, scattered in the wooded area about 200 yards northwest of the cabin, and, most unsettling, sealed within the smokehouse. In the smokehouse, the most damning evidence was found. Certain preserved meats appeared to be of human derivation, prepared in a manner suggesting knowledge of anatomy and preservation techniques. Dr. Hayes found cuts among the hanging meats that the search party had initially thought were venison or pork that were clearly human in origin. Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell were not found during the search, leaving investigators to speculate whether they had fled or perhaps encountered violence themselves, and the abandoned meal on their table remained an unexplained detail. The implications were horrific. The Stillwell brothers had reportedly been murdering travelers, stealing their valuables, and, most horrifyingly, turning their remains into food that they then served to other travelers who stopped at their cabin. A trapper who frequently worked the outlying parts of the county, Theodore Palmer, came forward with information in April 1868, claiming to have met Jeremiah Stillwell on December 11, 1867, the day before the brothers' disappearance was discovered. Palmer's affidavit states, "I was checking my lines up near Beaver Creek, maybe 5 miles north of their place, and he saw a man on horseback leading another horse with a bundle tied to it. Identified him as the younger brother of Stillwell. He appeared hurried and simply nodded before continuing to ride north without pausing to speak as he usually would. I didn't give it much thought until I learned that they had vanished." In contrast to the scene at the cabin with its half-eaten meal and abandoned personal belongings, Palmer's statement implied that at least Jeremiah Stillwell had left the property purposefully, taking provisions with him. Had Jeremiah fled while Elias stayed? Had Elias been a victim of his own brother? Or was there another reason for the seemingly contradictory evidence? Sheriff Harrington extended the search to areas north of the county, sending telegrams to authorities in neighboring regions with descriptions of the Stillwell brothers, with no confirmed sightings. More information about the brothers' background, or lack thereof, came to light as the investigation continued through the spring and summer of 1868. Efforts to track down their purported Kentucky roots were unsuccessful. Neither Elias nor Jeremiah Stillwell's records were found in Kentucky or the surrounding states, and their pre-Webster County history was unknown. This lack of verifiable history suggested that Stillwell was an assumed name, possibly used to hide a criminal past elsewhere. Sheriff Harrington sent inquiries to law enforcement in several states, hoping to learn about similar crimes or suspects who fit the brothers' descriptions. A small journal, presumably belonging to Jeremiah Stillwell, was discovered in the hidden chamber where personal belongings had been discovered. It was wedged behind a loose stone in the wall and contained entries from 1864 to 1866, most of which were mundane notes about chores or the weather, but some of which contained disturbing references. For example, in August 1864, the journal stated, "He says the stew needs more salt." No difference is noticeable to travelers. I occasionally wonder if they have suspicions. Another, dated April 1865, said, "Today there are 3 men. The well keeps our secret, deserters from the army." "Too risky," E replied, "but they had a nice gun and nice boots. Nobody is going to search for them." Made their coffee with the special herbs. Sheriff Harrington ordered the well to be drained and examined, a task that proved challenging and dangerous because the well extended over 60 feet into the limestone beneath the property, and when workers finally reached the bottom, they discovered a layer of silt and debris about 3 feet deep. These cryptic entries suggested that the brothers had not only been killing travelers for years, but that they had developed methods to incapacitate their victims, possibly using poison. The reference to the well was especially unsettling because it suggested that evidence might be hidden there. A gold wedding band bearing the initials M.H. to J. H. 1858. Several teeth, buttons, a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be human hair of various colors tied with thread into neat bundles, and numerous small bones, later identified as finger and toe bones, were among the items recovered from the well. Dr. Hayes examined these findings and concluded that the well had likely been used to dispose of certain remains that were not processed for other purposes, and his report noted that the preservation of these items suggested they had been in the well for varying lengths of time, some possibly as long as 3 years. Sheriff Harrington insisted that the case remain open, but resources were diverted to more urgent issues, and the Stillwell property, a scene of horrifying crimes, remained abandoned, the county unable to legally dispose of it without resolution regarding its owners. The discovery in the well provided additional evidence of the brothers' crimes, but many questions remained, the most important of which was what had happened to Elias and Jeremiah Stillwell. By August 1868, the investigation was coming to an end, with no new leads and the brothers still missing. Although the Stillwell brothers' gruesome hospitality quickly became part of local folklore, the case would remain officially unsolved for nearly a century, and locals had little doubt about the brothers' guilt, but the question of their fate continued to provoke speculation and debate. Parents cautioned children to be wary of strangers offering food or shelter, and travelers passing through the area gave the property a wide berth, crossing themselves as they went. The cabin itself started to deteriorate, with vegetation gradually reclaiming the cleared land surrounding it. A third theory, whispered rather than spoken out loud, was that the brothers had finally turned against one another, their partnership breaking down into murderous conflict. The half-eaten meal and the abandoned belongings hinted at a sudden and unexpected end to their operation. Still, others thought they had escaped justice, running away to the Western territories or possibly even abroad. Still, others thought they had been caught by one of their intended targets. a traveler who had learned of their true nature and turned the tables on his would-be killers. Regardless of the reality, the Stillwell brothers and their horrific murders were forgotten. A dark legend of the Ozark Hills that persisted for decades. The case closed but unresolved. The victims mostly forgotten, and the brothers' fate unknown. If it weren't for Clarence Thornton, a history professor at Missouri State University, then Southwest Missouri State College, who became interested in the region's unsolved crimes, the Stillwell case might have remained a dark footnote in Ozark history. Thornton asked to access Webster County's archived records in 1952 while working on a book on frontier justice, and that same year, while renovating the Webster County Courthouse, workers found a sealed compartment in the basement that contained documents believed to have been destroyed in a fire in 1892. Among these were other documents pertaining to the Stillwell case, such as a number of photographs taken at the scene, some of the first crime scene photos in Missouri history, and detailed inventories of the items discovered in the hidden chamber. The photographs, albeit deteriorated, showed the cabin interior, the tunnel that had been excavated, and the collection of personal belongings. One particularly disturbing picture showed the interior of the smokehouse with its hanging meats, taken before their true nature was discovered. The black and white image's clinical detachment somehow made it more unsettling when viewed with the knowledge of what it actually depicted. Thornton also discovered correspondence between Sheriff Harrington and other state authorities that had not been part of the official case file, but most importantly, he discovered a letter dated June 3, 1868, from the sheriff of Daviess County, Kentucky, answering Harrington's questions regarding the Stillwell brothers. No record of Stillwell brothers as described. Nonetheless, the 1861 example exhibits comparable trends. After being accused of grave robbing and poisoning patrons at their wayside tavern, brothers Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley vanished. Your suspects match the descriptions. Joshua would now be about 34 years old, and Ezekiel about 37. Both are renowned for their peculiar fascination with preservation techniques and anatomy. Before being fired for an undisclosed offense, Joshua temporarily served as a neighborhood doctor's assistant. This connection added a new dimension to the case by indicating that the Stillwell brothers had probably been the Hartleys, who had fled to Missouri during the tumult of the Civil War and altered their identities. It also revealed that their pattern of predatory behavior had evidently started earlier and in a different state. Thornton's further investigation turned up more information about the Hartley brothers. Newspaper archives from Kentucky showed that the brothers had run a small tavern called Hartley's Rest on a road between Owensboro and Hartford from 1858 to 1861, attracting travelers despite its remote location with its reputation for serving unusually flavorful stews and meat pies. Suspicions were raised in early 1861 when the local cemetery reported evidence of grave tampering, and at about the same time, a number of travelers who had stopped at Hartley's Rest went missing, prompting an investigation by the local authorities. However, before they could question the brothers in depth, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley vanished, leaving their tavern overnight. The physical descriptions and ages matched, and the similarities to the Stillwell case were striking. Brothers running a roadside business serving travelers, mysterious disappearances, and a sudden disappearance when suspicions were raised. The theory that the Hartleys had rebranded themselves as the Stillwells and carried on their predatory activities in Missouri was also supported. The long cold case received a new lease on life in 1953 when Thornton's findings were published in the Journal of Ozark Studies. His article, Serving More Than Water, The Stillwell Brothers' Reign of Terror, provided the most comprehensive account of the case to date, combining his own discoveries with the original investigation. After Thornton was published, an old woman named Sarah Wilkes wrote to him with a family legend. Her grandfather, James Wilkes, had been part of Sheriff Harrington's search party in 1868, and family legend says the search had turned up more than was officially recorded. Grandfather wouldn't speak of it much, she wrote in her letter to Thornton, but on his deathbed in 1911, he told my father about a hidden room they found beneath the cabin floor. He said that it included a chair with restraints and what he described as instruments of torture. To protect the relatives of the missing, Sheriff Harrington instructed them not to mention it in reports. While impossible to independently confirm, the grandfather's statement that he never slept after what he saw there was consistent with some discrepancies in the official records. A number of pages from the inventory of items found on the property seemed to be missing, with numbering that jumped from page 7 to page 11. It is unclear whether these pages were removed on purpose or simply lost to time. Thornton's investigation also revealed an intriguing detail regarding the brothers' disappearance. Evidence indicated a third person had been present, despite the fact that the Harlow for suspicious behavior and possession of personal effects that were not their own. The brothers were detained for a short time, but were later released due to a lack of evidence, and their physical characteristics matched those of the Stillwell/Hartley brothers, indicating that they may have taken on several identities during their criminal careers. Another researcher discovered documents from a small southern Illinois town that showed two brothers named Stillman had run a boarding house there for about 6 months in early 1863 before leaving abruptly after a guest vanished. Once more, the descriptions fit, suggesting a pattern of movement and identity changes as the brothers stayed one step ahead of suspicion. These findings depicted the brothers as cunning predators who had honed their techniques over time, learning from each near miss and growing more cautious with each new identity. By the time they established themselves in Webster County as the Stillwells, they had reportedly devised a system that allowed them to prey on travelers for years without being discovered. When construction workers excavated a shallow grave about 12 miles north of the former Stillwell property in 1955, they discovered human remains buried in a hillside. The medical examiner determined that the remains belonged to a man in his 30s who had died about 80 to 90 years earlier, and that the cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the back of his skull. The remains were found with a pocket watch that had the initials E.S. engraved on the inside of the case, which led investigators to believe they had located Elias Stillwell, who had been buried far from the cabin he had shared with his brother. Palmer's 1868 reported seeing Jeremiah Stillwell riding north on December 11, 1867, and the location was consistent with Palmer's 1868. The remains were examined further, and the medical examiner discovered that the victim's right hand was completely missing, apparently removed post-mortem with a sharp instrument. This unusual detail seemed ritualistic rather than practical, suggesting something more complicated than a simple murder. The discovery of what appeared to be the remains of Elias Stillwell prompted a renewed search of the area, but no trace of Jeremiah was found. If he had gone north after burying his brother, he had left no trace. No trace of Jeremiah Stillwell or Joshua Hartley was ever found. Port City records were examined for any indication that he had left the country, but if he had taken another assumed name. A retired sheriff from Pike County, Illinois, contacted Thornton in 1958 with an interesting lead. In 1869, about a year after the Stillwell brothers vanished, a man who fit Jeremiah's description had been briefly arrested in Pittsfield, Illinois, for interrogation over a suspicious death at a boarding house where he had been staying. The man, who identified himself as Jeremy Stillson, was freed when witnesses gave him an alibi, and he left town right away and was never seen again. This tantalizing clue raised the possibility that Jeremiah continued his predatory ways after leaving Missouri, albeit perhaps with more caution and without a partner. But the trail ended there, with no additional sightings or records that could be conclusively connected to the missing brother. The Webster County Historical Society placed a tiny marker near the location of the cabin in 1967, precisely 100 years after the brother vanished. The inscription simply reads, "Site of the Stillwell Cabin, 1863 to 1868, without mentioning the siblings' crimes. Scene of unsolved disappearances that haunted the frontier of the Ozarks. The site itself has long since reverted to wilderness, with the cabin having collapsed sometime in the early 1900s. Locals continue to avoid the area after dark, claiming that the well occasionally produces echoes when nothing has been dropped into it, and that sounds of digging can occasionally be heard on still nights." In light of the case's centennial, the Springfield News Leader published a week-long series on the Stillwell brothers that included all the research and findings since the initial investigation. The articles generated public interest in the case, and several people came forward with family stories or documents that added small details to the historical record. One particularly useful contribution was from the descendants of Dr. William Hayes, the county physician who had examined the remains found on the Stillwell property. Hayes's granddaughter gave Thornton a journal he had kept, which contained more thorough notes about his findings than had been included in the official reports. "I am documenting these observations independently from my official report because their nature is too upsetting for public consumption," Hayes had written. "There is proof of specialized knowledge in the preparation of the human remains discovered in the smokehouse. The evidence that selection was not random is the most troubling." These private notes confirmed what many had suspected, but few had been willing to state explicitly. The Stillwell brothers had not only killed and robbed their victims, but had processed and consumed their remains with deliberate methodology, suggesting a level of depravity beyond simple murder for profit. The meat was not merely cut from bone, but processed with techniques one might expect from a trained butcher or medical professional. Some parts were obviously preferred over others, suggesting a ritualistic or preferential aspect to the brothers' consumption patterns. It seems that some organs were meticulously removed and kept apart. A box of his ancestors' personal papers, including a journal that Thomas Weston had kept in his later years, was donated to the Webster County Historical Society in 1968 by Harold Weston, a retired postal worker and the great-grandson of Thomas Weston, who had found the abandoned cabin. In an entry dated April 17, 1882, Weston made the shocking admission, "I have carried this secret for 15 years, but find I cannot take it to my grave." I didn't tell the sheriff the complete truth about how I found the Stillwell property abandoned. I had already made numerous cautious and solitary stops there. Elias was dead at the table, his face in his stew, when I got there on the last day. Jeremiah trembled like a leaf and grabbed a rifle. He declared that he could no longer bear it, and that he would inform. He forced me to assist him in getting Elias mounted. Together, we rode north until we located a good burial site. Jeremiah told me he was going to the Oregon Territory after giving me a gold watch and $50 in exchange for my silence. Since then, I haven't seen him. I pray that God would pardon me for my complicity in silence. If true, this confession raised some questions and answered others. It explained the missing meal and Elias's disappearance, but not why Jeremiah had left all his possessions behind. It implicated Thomas Weston in a cover-up, which called into question other aspects of his testimony, and, most importantly, it alluded to a rift between the brothers that had resulted in violence, with Elias seemingly wanting to confess their crimes, and Jeremiah choosing to silence him rather than face justice. This human element gave the case a new dimension, implying that even among such depraved people, conscience could occasionally surface with deadly consequences. More background was given by later entries in Weston's journal, where he described how he had visited the Stillwell cabin many times while on his postal route and frequently accepted food from the brothers. "I never suspected the true nature of their stew," he wrote, "and God help me, I ate it with relish, praising them for its rich flavor. During those dinners, how many unfortunate people crossed my lips. The thought torments me nightly." Weston also described conversations with Jeremiah after Elias's death as they rode north with the body. According to his account, Jeremiah spoke of their history, revealing that they had begun their crimes in Kentucky after their parents died, leaving them destitute. What had started as grave robbing for valuables had evolved into something far more sinister when they discovered they could profit from both the possessions and remains of their victims. He spoke of it so matter-of-factly, Weston wrote, as if discussing the weather or crop prices. They claimed to have honed their techniques over time, discovering which herbs will put tourists to sleep without compromising the food's flavor. He appeared pleased with their effectiveness and the fact that they had left no witnesses until Elias's conscience started to bother him. Although it could not be independently validated a century later, Weston's narrative offered the most direct evidence yet of what had occurred to the Stillwell brothers, and his journal stopped suddenly in 1883, indicating that he may have died shortly after documenting these admissions. Historians and crime researchers continued to debate the full truth of the Stillwell case. Some suggest that Jeremiah killed his brother to end their killing spree. Perhaps developing a conscience suggests they may have been masking the true nature of the meat they served. The remains discovered on the Stillwell property were photographed and described by a team from the University of Missouri's Anthropology Department in 1969. The team's analysis found that the processing methods used demonstrated remarkable consistency and anatomical knowledge, supporting the idea that the brothers had developed specific techniques over time, possibly refining them through multiple iterations. The anthropologists also noted that the removal of certain body parts appeared selective rather than random, with special attention paid to muscle groups from the thighs, shoulders, and back, cuts that would be considered prime in traditional butchery. This selective approach suggested not only practical knowledge, but also a ritualized or preferential aspect of their consumption of human flesh. Despite the lack of a trial or conclusive evidence regarding the fate of Jeremiah Stillwell, the Missouri State Police closed the Stillwell case in 1969 and declared it solved, concluding that the brothers had murdered at least 21 travelers between 1863 and 1867, robbing them of their valuables and processing their remains for consumption and evidence disposal. Throughout the 1970s, criminologists used the Stillwell case as a study in how isolated environments and transient victims created opportunities for predators to operate undetected for extended periods of time, and interest in the case periodically resurfaced when similar crimes were found elsewhere in the nation, drawing comparisons to other historical cases of cannibalism and serial murder. Eleanor Phillips, a historian, made an interesting connection in 1972 while studying Oregon territorial records. In 1869, a man named Jerome Stillman bought land near Portland and set up a small way station for travelers going to and from the city. The physical description matched what was known about Jeremiah Stillwell, and the timing matched Thomas Weston's assertion that Jeremiah had gone to Oregon Territory. Phillips discovered that Stillman had run his way station for about 3 years before selling the property and going missing from the records, during which at least 2 travelers had been reported missing after being spotted approaching his property. But no investigation seemed to have linked these disappearances to Stillman. This discovery suggested that Jeremiah might have continued his predatory behavior after fleeing Missouri, though perhaps with greater caution and a quicker willingness to move on when suspicions arose. The pattern fit with what was known of the brothers' earlier movements through Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri. establishing themselves in relatively isolated locations, preying on travelers, and relocating when necessary. However, the trail went cold after Stillman sold his Oregon property in 1872. If Jeremiah Stillwell had adopted yet another identity, he had done so without leaving records that could be connected to his previous personas. Whether he eventually faced justice, died of natural causes, or continued his crimes under another name remains unknown. The final whereabouts of Jeremiah Stillwell remain a mystery. If Thomas Weston's belated confession was accurate, Jeremiah headed to Oregon Territory. Records from that region show several men of similar description arriving between 1868 and 1870, but none who can be conclusively identified as the missing brother. During the 1975 renovations of a historic building in Sacramento, California, workers found a cache of documents in a wall cavity, including a journal from 1873 to 1878, written by a man who only identified himself as J.S., detailing his life as a cook in a mining camp in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, with some passages raising unsettling similarities to the Stillwell case. The author described secret ingredients that gave his stews their unique flavor and special techniques for preparing meat, mentioning that miners occasionally vanished from the camp, but that these incidents were infrequent and rarely looked into. We spent years honing our art together, yet he was weak in the end. The visitors were unaware of the food they were served at our table. I have to be more careful here, but there are still lots of options. The journal ended abruptly in October 1878 with no indication of what happened to its author, but the similarities were so strong that some scholars believe it provides evidence that Jeremiah Stillwell continued his murderous activities in California after leaving Oregon, even though it could not be conclusively linked to him. One of the darkest episodes in Ozark history, the Stillwell case reminds us that in the vast wilderness of post-Civil War America, travelers entrusted. Strangers with their lives at every stop. It is a story of frontier isolation, opportunistic predation, and unspeakable horror concealed by simple hospitality. Even though the land where the Stillwell cabin used to be is private property, unmarked and unvisited, the earth remembers what happened there, even if human memory fades. According to local sources, the well was filled in the 1970s after several animals were discovered dead nearby, and the water was reportedly contaminated by something seeping from the surrounding soil. The road that used to lead travelers to the brothers' door has long since been rerouted, and the old path is now hardly visible as a depression in the forest floor. In 1980, the Webster County Historical Society conducted an archaeological survey of the Stillwell property, hoping to find additional evidence that might shed light on unanswered questions. The foundation of the cabin was still visible, as were the collapsed remains of the root cellar and smokehouse. Excavation revealed few new insights, but soil samples taken from around the well showed unusually high concentrations of human bone fragments, suggesting that the brothers had disposed of remains there over an extended period. The archaeologists also found evidence of a previously undiscovered pit approximately 50 yards behind the smokehouse, which contained a layer of ash and charred bone fragments, indicating that some remains had been burned rather than processed or buried. These findings confirmed the brothers' methodical approach to disposing of evidence. They appeared to have used multiple methods, processing some remains for consumption, burying others, burning some, and disposing of yet others in the well, making it unlikely that all their victims would ever be identified or accounted for. In addition, the archaeological team found a small tin box buried beneath what had been the hearth of the cabin, which contained a daguerreotype photograph of two young men standing next to an older couple, likely their parents, with the inscription, Ezekiel and Joshua Hartley with mother and father, 1848. This provided the only known image of the brothers and confirmed their original identities. The photograph showed two young men who looked normal, with Joshua, later Jeremiah, wearing what appeared to be a slight smile, and Ezekiel, later Elias, wearing a serious expression. Nothing in their appearance suggested the depravity they would later display, a reminder that monsters frequently have unremarkable faces. In a final chilling footnote to this case, a historian studying Missouri Civil War documents in 1961 found that in October 1863, just after the brothers had taken up residence on the Stillwell property, a Union patrol had stopped for a short time at a cabin that matched the location of the property. The patrol leader's report stated that he had taken a meal from two Kentucky men recently settled, and that 3 of his men became ill afterward, but that all recovered. Had this been an early failed attempt by the brothers to claim victims? If so, it indicates that their strategy improved over time, becoming more successful and leaving fewer survivors to sound the alarm. Lieutenant James Moley, the patrol leader, reported that he found the brothers oddly hospitable, considering the tensions in the area, and that their cabin appeared unusually well appointed for men so recently settled. Describing a meal of hearty stew with meat of indeterminate origin, and observing that the brothers appeared disappointed when the patrol announced that they would be continuing their journey instead of camping for the night. This description, along with the brothers' known history in Kentucky, suggests that they had already decided to commit murder, and that they had not wasted any time in trying to continue their predatory activities. The fact that the patrol members survived may suggest that the brothers were still honing the herbs or poisons they would use to render their victims incapacitated. Several elderly Webster County residents who had grown up hearing stories about the Stillwell brothers were interviewed by a doctoral student studying historical criminal psychology in 1985. One common theme he had a special interest in those that make you sleepy or confused. This interest in medicinal or poisonous plants was consistent with the brothers' known background. Joshua Hartley had worked briefly as a doctor's assistant in Kentucky before being fired, possibly gaining knowledge of both anatomy and pharmaceuticals. The brothers may have combined this formal knowledge with local folk traditions to develop methods for subduing their victims without struggle. He claimed it was for his brother's headaches, but people later questioned whether they weren't using those plants on their visitors. An examination of the brothers' shopping habits at Martha Simmons' General Store revealed that they frequently purchased herbs and other items that, although harmless on their own, might be combined to produce sedative compounds. For example, valerian root, some types of mushrooms, and large amounts of alcohol could have been used to make preparations that would induce drowsiness or compliance in travelers. How many travelers simply disappeared on those isolated Ozark roads, their disappearances never linked to the murderous brothers? How many families never found out what happened to loved ones who set out on journeys and never arrived? Perhaps descendants of Jeremiah Stillwell continue to live somewhere, unaware of their ancestors' dark legacy or carrying secrets of their own. What is unknown about the Stillwell case is perhaps the most terrifying part of it. When a true crime writer published The Stillwell Brothers, America's Forgotten Predators, a thorough analysis of the case that included all available evidence and theories. In 1992, the case gained new attention from a new generation of readers and became a regional bestseller. After the book was published, a woman from Northern California contacted the author with a fascinating family story. Her great-grandfather had run a boarding house in Sacramento in the late 1870s, and one of his tenants was a middle-aged man who worked as a cook at various establishments around the city and who, according to family legend, died suddenly in 1879 of what appeared to be a stroke. When the boarding house owner cleaned out his room, he discovered a locked trunk filled with various personal belongings, including a journal with entries that so troubled the boarding house owner that he burned it after reading only a few pages. The woman thought that John Smith might have been Jeremiah Stillwell in his final identity based on the timing and description. If this account is correct, it implies that Jeremiah Stillwell eluded justice throughout his life, taking the full truth of his crimes to his grave. The known victims represent only those who could be connected to the brothers through the evidence found at their Missouri cabin, likely a fraction of their total victims across multiple states and identities. This connection, though unproven, presents a plausible end to Jeremiah's story. Dying anonymously in California, his true identity and horrific crimes known only to himself. For those who know the story, traveling through the Missouri Ozarks still evokes a chill of awareness, a reminder that not everyone who extended hospitality to tired travelers did so with good intentions. The sound of water still reverberates in that deep well, even when it is filled with earth. The whispers of the past never really go away in places where such darkness once resided. "All these years we wondered what happened to him," she said, "but now we know, though the truth is more horrible than anything we imagined." The Stillwell case gained national attention in 2004 when it was featured in an episode of a popular television series on historical crimes, which featured interviews with historians, criminologists, and descendants of Webster County residents who had been involved in the original investigation. One particularly moving segment featured an elderly woman whose great-grandfather had vanished while traveling through Missouri in 1866, and his name had been discovered in the Stillwell ledger, confirming a family suspicion that had lasted for generations. The post-Civil War frontier provided ideal conditions for predators. Remote areas, migratory populations, a lack of law enforcement, and the chaos of a society rebuilding after war. Travelers frequently had no choice but to rely on the hospitality of strangers, creating vulnerability that the Stillwell brothers ruthlessly exploited. Though their crimes were shocking, they were made possible by the particular circumstances of their time and place. Although they undoubtedly made money from their crimes by stealing valuables from their victims, the brothers appear to have found a deeper sense of fulfillment in their control over life and death and in their covert knowledge of what they were serving their guests. Their tactics, providing food and shelter to exhausted travelers, using the remains of their victims as food for future victims, and gathering trophies in their hidden chamber, indicate a level of depravity that goes beyond simple financial motivation. The brothers' preference for travelers as victims demonstrates an understanding of opportunity and risk management that allowed them to operate undetected for years. The fact that they served their victims' remains to subsequent travelers adds a layer of psychological complexity that continues to disturb those who study the case. The brothers left no explicit explanation of their motivations, leaving researchers to speculate based on their actions and the few writings that survived. Criminologists who have studied the case note that the brothers' behavior shows elements of what would now be classified as serial killing, though with pragmatic components uncommon in modern cases. Even though the Stillwell case is taught in criminology classes today as an example of historical